Hey guys, it's Trafotin. I've had a bad week. Not because the screen on my laptop recently went out, but more recently, the Linux community is making me very disappointed. It's not because someone in Fedora decided to move 32-bit libraries. It's not because of the precious Wayland and freedesktop.org standards getting stalled. But hang on a second. Didn't everything you just mentioned, isn't that all just Linux drama? What is the impact that all of this has on me? But before we get into that, I want to take the time today to analyze the anatomy of Linux news and the impacts that the supposed Linux drama has on its users, but also the toll that it has on the communities that build software around Linux. So before we dive into any particular drama, I want to break down a really important part to covering stories on the internet. Now, I strongly prefer first-party sources whenever possible. It's really easy to read, but interpreting information is not, because interpreting is what we, as users or readers, need to do to act upon this information. For example, let's say that we're covering a new release of software like OBS Studio. As of time of writing, the newest release of OBS Studio is 31.0.4, and it's a hotfix release. Simply analyzing the patch notes is far too overwhelming for end users especially, unless you know what to look for. But if you're a developer who's actively working on projects around OBS, like for example Distro AV or OBS Virtual Webcam, it's actually very helpful for them to see these changes. Now, we as users could analyze the end product by opening OBS prior to the update, but it looks exactly the same as the last update, so what is there really to talk about? This is why we need to resort to interpretation, and as your resident content creator who knows a thing or two about OBS, I can at least authoritatively say about some of the highlights that would impact you as a Linux user. I have no proof of these, but instead, I will link to issues to reference them. First, there was a regression in previous versions of OBS on Linux where enabling OBS Virtual Webcam did not work. But Steve Matician, one of the programmers of OBS and v4l2 loopback, has also apologized for the regression, but it was probably not necessary and bound to happen just given how big of a project OBS is. And the reason I made a social post about this is because it's an ongoing issue for people who use OBS on Linux need to be aware of. But it's also to show the issue is known and it's being addressed. But it's also on me about everything that I say, whether it's accurate or not, but more importantly, what my audience chooses to do with this sorts of information. And no, you don't want to end up like the guy who locked the issue page. On a similar note, it's a wonder to me why many people are obsessed with the Linux kernel mailing list. First, there's nothing really exciting there unless someone is trying to support a specific type of hardware, like the new Intel or AMD processor, or maybe the new Realtek or Broadcom chip, and then we all move on with our lives and wish everybody the best. The problem is, every time someone brings up the Linux kernel mailing list or virtually anything involving Linus Torvalds, I can't help but feel a little creepy reading it. First, Linus strikes me as the engineering type, yet it's always really awkward when he's forced on stage to talk about silly things like leadership or the future of open source or interview people that he barely knows. I mean, he's never signed up for the fame and all of the attention, yet every single online Linux outlet obsesses over him. Secondly, and I think this is more important, mailing lists are emails, and emails by definition are personal correspondences which happen to be made public. In this respect, do you think that Linus Torvalds or Kent Overstreet or anyone who's involved in any Linux kernel drama or whatever intended anyone outside of their email chain to read their emails? I don't see my email on the mailing list. Your email probably isn't on the mailing list, else you wouldn't be talking about it. Therefore, it must not be relevant to my life, and therefore, it is not relevant to your life. Because they don't bother to address us or talk about any of this publicly. That's why they're all direct responses. Would you enjoy it if I read through your emails? Probably not, but Google probably reads through all your emails anyway. This is because a key way to identify if something is drama or not is to think about how people are addressing each other and how important the medium is to impacting that message. Mailing lists like the Linux kernel or Debian or Gentoo are not worth our time reading, because as end users, we are not the target audience. It is just for the people whose names are listed in the mailing list. When we talk about mailing lists, I think it's also important to talk about project politics. Now, don't unsubscribe just yet. This isn't so much about politically right or left as much as it is about project governance. Typically, when a project wants to make sweeping changes, the standard thing to do is to fly it by their main contributors so that they're aware of the changes that are being made. And a great example of this is GNOME's recent deprecation of X11 in the login manager GDM. GNOME's release manager Jordan Petridis puts up a GitLab issue, and everybody responds if they're ready to go or not. Some people submitted it through the GitLab issues page, but most people also did it through the GNOME Matrix channel. More recently, a more extreme version of this was the change proposal to Fedora created by members of Fedora's infrastructure team. Among them, the main proposal was made by Fabio Valenti, who made the suggestion that Fedora should stop packaging and maintaining libraries for 32-bit software within 2 years, as its aging architecture and it's a struggle for Fedora's programmers to manage, as more and more cruft gets added to aging architecture that very few people use anymore. And returning to the target audience, when we talk about something like Fedora's proposals are targeted towards developers who operate within Fedora's ecosystem. They are the primary audience, not end users. And unfortunately, because end users read this out of context, this news was not taken well. Because removing 32-bit applications caused breakages for applications like Steam. And of course, the group that would lose their minds is the most oppressed group of all, gamers. A particular quote that the users that opposed this discourse was from Kyle Gospotinich, the lead developer of Bazite. He initially made a post on Fedora's discourse forums of the proposal, which many perceived as trying to stop the proposal because of the detrimental effect that removing 32-bit libraries would have on Bazite as a project. But instead, many people tunnel visioned on the harms that removing 32-bit libraries would do to downstream Fedora projects. And because people like to ignore anything that isn't technically related, they completely ignored the overall message of developer fatigue. What's worse is online outlets and content creators drum this up as a catastrophic thing that would happen eventually. And this whole thing got so much attention that toxicity was sent to Fabio on the Fedora forums, and Kyle had to go on tours debunking claims and YouTube comments, or it being interviewed online. In fact, Kyle said that he was in favor of the proposal. He just thought that the proposal as it was currently written was too premature.
My initial proposition was to actually close that proposal and reopen it, because I felt the wording of it was going to ring alarm bells and result in a lot of bad press, which, it did, but it happens sometimes. People take things out of context or report things too early.
The Fedora 32-bit fiasco is just an example of touching on the surface of the damage that can happen with online discussion and when Linux users get involved when they shouldn't. Because when does online discussion actually impede on development effort? Well, unfortunately, there is one individual who knows this on the internet probably better than a lot of other Linux developers, and that's Sebastian Wick. Sebastian helps maintain Mutter and GDM and Flatpak and countless other things that we take for granted on desktop Linux. And one of the things that some trolls online focus on is Sebastian's work with Wayland and discussions about the standards in desktop Linux, or the XDG protocols, or freedesktop.org. Protocol discussions like Wayland and freedesktop.org standards already fail the qualifications I went through earlier. Once again, the target audience is developers, and users aren't meant to be browsing these issue pages. What's more is Sebastian is often painted as the reason many of these protocols have come to a halt and are inhibiting progress. You can see this in multiple YouTube comments online, or sometimes from even creators of people who claim that he is stalling the future of desktop Linux. I would like to remind everybody that if you are a user and are not the primary audience, discussions between developers, especially if they're on public places like forums or issue trackers, that's not really our business, especially when there are cases where interactions may happen on channels outside of the issue trackers between developers. Things like Discord, Matrix, social media, or even just IRL hangouts at the latest Linux conference. As an alternative reading to appease Linux losers, I do want to offer a couple of thoughts. First, who are we as users to define what is important as a protocol or standard? Standards are very serious things, and making definitive decisions can have serious impact on all desktop Linux projects going forward. And these things need to be picked apart and deliberated carefully because somebody has to keep them in shape, not just immediately, but for years to come. If people aren't willing to step up and help run the show, why should the same people be allowed to decide what happens if they aren't willing to submit some work? Second, Sebastian in particular has been sent multiple disparaging comments and is frequently branded as a troll by people who don't know any better online because they think they know better because they skinned their open box or whatever. He helps maintain GDM, which ironically the same people who accuse him of being a troll label as the most reliable and stable login manager. Please give Sebastian a break. What are you doing in Linux today? Because let's consider this. If the same people online will spread the discourse that we saw in Fedora's 32-bit libraries, and with threats being sent out to project leaders like Sebastian, it's no wonder why there's so much animosity between Linux's users and Linux's developers. Because the people who send out these threats or spread false information are actually actively wasting developers' time, who could be spending their effort doing better things. Instead, they need to spend that effort on combating trolls, putting out PR fires, or getting demoralized online and hopefully not being subjected to real-world harm. This also has tangible consequences on FOSS projects when literal governments pay hundreds of thousands of dollars to get things done on Linux, and that precious money and developer time is wasted because somebody happened to create a conspiracy from a GitLab. It's these Linux users, or who I actively now brand as Linux losers, who have effectively ruined online discourse and all online news related to Linux. It's the chase for daily content, which leads to junk articles and videos about applications that probably needed more time to cook in the oven before people started using them and were told to use them. But the only thing that gets accomplished is wasting valuable volunteer hours for a developer, who ultimately isn't getting paid and is essentially locked in for life because nobody will pick up the work that they're doing because it's thankless. And this is a disease that is rampant in online Linux communities, and it desperately needs a cure. I want to end with a few questions that can easily determine if something about Linux or free and open source software is worth your time or not. Does it affect you or a loved one whose computer you have touched? And I say that the way that I did because, yes, I know my audience. No new Linux users actually watch tech YouTube channels. Instead, it is people who are IT professionals or who are people who have to solve these problems for their friends and family. More importantly, is there a call to action that would lead to positive change? Does you talking about this issue have the potential to cause speculation? Or could it be construed as spreading fear, uncertainty, and doubt? If it does, you should probably stop talking about what you're doing already and come back after talking to a local developer that you know, or probably just sending them a quiet email online and they'll probably get back to you as long as you're polite about it. And the fourth is, if there is any harm, and now that people are aware of it, what can we do to counteract harm? And I will say this right now because this is very important. As much as people like to say it, if this involves shouting on social media, it doesn't count. It needs to be something that you can take the initiative on and take control of something in your life. You don't control what happens in other people's lives, but you can control what happens in your life. What are you going to do? Not what is Bobby going to do, it's what are you going to do? Because once you answer all of these questions, this is how you can identify if Linux news is actually Linux drama and is actually a complete waste of your time. If I see any of this on my socials, I will 100% make fun of you, and shame you. Shame on the people who spread threats and misinformation because you are ruining Linux for the rest of us. No, I'm sure I've made a bunch of people angry, but I'm sure the people who are already angry have already clicked off and left the video. So now that you're here and you've made it this far, why don't you go leave a like on this video? If you leave a like on this video, maybe you could hear me actually address Linux news in real time and tell you how useless and pointless it all really is. And if you like to learn more about the work that I do, you can always visit my website, trafotin.com. If you don't want to hear me ranting in audio form, you can instead read me ranting in written form on my website. And if you'd like to support the work that I do, you can also give me money through Patreon, YouTube memberships, and cryptocurrency. And if I am trying to work on getting commentary tracks for all of the big tech events, it's super tricky because the versions that I watch are always the raw, uncut big tech events, Microsoft getting protested out by people and all. And unfortunately, getting a commentary track is something that I have to put a lot of effort into, but I would like to do for the people who pay me money. With that all being said, I would like to thank all of you for watching, and I will see all of you next time.